25 years ago, the primary question in over 100,000 Spokane area households was, will we have power for Thanksgiving? Wash and water power dispatchers could only answer maybe as their line crews scrambled to get the power back on. Ham radio operators provided critical communications. Grocery stores improvised how to keep their cold foods sections cold. And hospitals became popular restaurants and a source of showers. Listen to stories from key first responders, including Mike Fitzsimmons, former Fire Chief Bobby Williams, and Sheriff John Goldman as they reminisce about Ice Storm 96.
Well, what were you doing in November of 1996?
Oh, well, I was the general manager of American Medical Response at the time. And I believe it was AMR. I'm not sure if it was one of their predecessors, but at any rate, I was the general manager of the ambulance service in Spokane at the time. And as I recall, on that day, it kind of started out snowy and wet. There were these predictions of, an ice storm coming in, but nobody really knew what an ice storm, or at least I didn't really know what an ice storm really would look like. And I was soon to find out, because prior to the bulk of the storm hitting, it was snowing. It was a wet snow, and typically with wet snow, it's very slippery. So we had a lot of car accidents going on. We had a number of folks who had fallen on the sidewalk. So our call volumes were already going up. And then we started hearing this prediction, kind of this gradual move from the west towards Spokane, where there was ice. And so, we started gearing up, and it was late afternoon, probably. I want to recall, I know it was getting towards dark, and all of a sudden, everything just started happening. Trees were falling. There were more motor vehicle crashes. The hospitals were busy. All of our units were constantly moving. And then in the middle of all this, our power went out at the station at Sharp and Monroe. And thankfully, we had a generator at the time, or a uninterrupted power source. So our UPS kicked in, which kept our dispatch system, our radio system, and our computer-aided dispatch going. But we knew we only had about 20 to 25 minutes of UPS before, we had to have our generator kick on. The mothership of our company had sent us a surplus from inside the company generator, but it was a diesel powered generator, which worked fabulously in the summer and spring when we would test it, until such time as it got so cold that the diesel fuel gelled and we could not get that thing started for anything. So in amongst all the calls and everything else, I had to kind of pull together our leadership team and say, okay, we're about to lose all of our power. What are our options? We decided that we would move an ambulance out of the bay so that it was outside in the elements where we'd have better radio transmission, and use that as our dispatch center. And then telephones, we actually maintain our telephone system, believe it or not, with some limited capacity. So then we also took one of the 7-digit numbers and transferred it to my state-of-the-art at the time Motorola brick cell phone. And so,
Mike, there are people watching this are going to have no idea what that even means, but I do.
Well, that was the interesting part, is I had no idea if that was going to work or not. And in fact, it did work. So we actually put somebody in the ambulance with that phone to answer phones that would come in. And then the other person in the ambulance would actually dispatch our units. And that's the way we functioned for about 8 hours. It was just, it was really, really, really a very cumbersome and clunky system, but we were able to dispatch ambulances and get them on scene and answer phone calls. And I don't believe we dropped any phone calls, requests for ambulances at the time.
Well, that morning, Sulani, I did my morning news, early morning news, and then I did my 3-hour talk show on KXLY. And I left just around 1 o'clock, and I was headed home for the day because I'd put in my shift. And when I got out into the parking lot, I'm hearing these strange noises, these cracking noises, like people breaking sticks. I'm thinking, what the devil is that? And I start looking around, and you could see from the parking lot up to toward the higher South Hill neighborhoods, and I'm seeing these flashes of blue, and they're like somebody taking flashbulb camera shots at a wedding. And I'm thinking, what the devil is this? And a few seconds later, there'd be the report of the cracking sound, and these were transformers blowing up there. And then I got it. I realized what was going on, because obviously it wasn't that cold out on the 19th of November of 1996. It had been down in the 20s overnight, but it was cold at the surface. It was a little warmer above. And so when the rain began to fall, it fell as rain, but when it contacted solid objects, cars, trees, windows, windshields and such, it obviously froze on contact, and then it started to build up layer by layer by layer. And you could see that there was a significant layer of ice all over everything at that point. And I'm thinking, okay, so this is what's going on. The weight of that ice is breaking limbs, but the rapidity with which this was happening and the volume of it, it was quite clear to me that this was going to be a big story, because areas would lose transformers, and then soon it'd be dark up there, a little black spot up there on the horizon and what have you. And so it became clear that we needed to do something to be sure we were covering this. So I went back into the station, and I told them I was going to go have my lunch, and I'm coming back, and we're going to go live and with talk radio, obviously, with the situation. Didn't know exactly to what extent it might go, and had no idea, obviously, that it was going to be quite had an impact as it had been that we would be facing for days to come. So it was interesting. So I got back, and we went on the air, and I worked late into the evening that first night, and then every day thereafter for several days and nights.
Tell me about how it started out, looking out those conference room windows.
Well, actually, I was looking north, and I saw the fireworks, all the transformers and the town going black. And I thought, well, this looks like it could be a really horrible thing. It reminded me, I hate to say this, it reminded me of September 11th.
Mm.
And when I got up, I was drinking a cup of coffee or tea, at the house. And I went, I need to go. When the second tower got hit, I went, I need to go in. And that I had the same feeling in Ice Storm, kind of the same feeling when I reminisced about it. And but yeah, I was looking north, and it was like the town was just going black, all the way from the east side to the west side. And I went, well, this isn't good. And had a little bit of flicker of lights in the boardroom, because the generators were coming on, because they noticed that there was some kind of malfunction. But we never really lost power. We never had to go to generators at Sacred Heart anyway. Deaconess had a little bit of a problem from what I understand, but we didn't seem to have a problem. And so I got with the administrators. I said, we need to meet in the boardroom. And I think at the time it was Jerry Leahy, but anyway, I got the vice presidents together, and we started talking about what are our resources? And that's kind of where it went from there. So,
Yeah, so you were the one in charge of disaster planning for Sacred Heart. That's how we first met on the Spokane County Disaster Council.
correct, yeah. And
So,
they were,
so what was your plan?
and they just went through some incident command training.
Mm-hmm.
I see courses in administration, because I thought, well, let's start at the top and we'll work our way down. And eventually we ended up training about 40 people in the incident command structure. So it went pretty well, but they were a little reluctant, at least in their faces, when I said, well, who's the incident commander? And they all went, well, would be whoever the vice president on call is. And I went, okay, well, that's who you want to be with the IC. And then they all fall into their positions pretty well. So it was actually a pretty good thing. I mean, just in time training.
Dr. Jim Nania, I've known him for a long time as a medical program director for Spokane County. And for people that don't know, that means he has to put up with a whole bunch of EMTs, and we have to put up with him. And so you were part of the emergency response for Ice Storm 96. And tell me about how that day unfolded for you.
Well, it was quite startling for everyone, I think. The power went out. And so we all scrambled. And I think one of the great challenges, obviously, for everyone is, you've got important assignments, perhaps healthcare, work, and law enforcement and everything else, but you also got to take care of your family. So you can't just forget about it and let the house freeze. So there's always the attendant personal responsibilities to family and friends, and then what you got to do work-wise. But it was a strange morning for sure. The town was pretty much shut down. The coating of ice was very apparent and unique, I think, and I hope it stays unique in our experience. And then the obvious implications for the loss of power, which was widely reported right away. More than 100,000, I think, homes lost their power or facilities. And the temperatures weren't good. It was cold. So that immediately put many of our citizens at peril for, environmental exposure to cold temperatures. Not to mention other things that occurred when everything was coated with ice. For example, we had a little log in the ER. We had a lot of falls associated with the slippery. I mean, everything was coated with ice. I think almost everyone I knew fell at some point in the course of the first 24 hours. You just step on what should be okay, but it was coated with ice. And then we had quite a surge of carbon monoxide poisoning. And this is a lesson I think we need to keep in mind whenever we lose power. Before it happened again in windstorm, people use alternative sources of heat, and sometimes the ventilation associated with them is not adequate. So we had numerous cases of carbon monoxide poisoning associated with trying to start the hibachi grill in your home, that kind of thing. And there were also a series of automobile crashes associated with it because of the slippery conditions. There were injuries associated with the cleanup, which occurred fairly immediately. But I think we, I mean the municipal, we encouraged people to go out there and try to clear the debris such as they could to open roadways, because many places you couldn't get emergency vehicles through because the roads were occluded with tree branches and trees in some cases. So, but in the process of clearing those, people, I think I remember a statement, people, if you have a chainsaw and know how to use it, go get it. And I think that was a good thing, but there were injuries associated with branches falling and trees falling on people and things like that as well. So there were multiple ripples.
Oh, I was just going to say, I found that note in the press release about if you have a chainsaw, please go out and start clearing things out.
Yes.
I'm not sure they would say the same thing today.
They probably should, though. They probably, if you're confident in your skills with a chainsaw, they may put a little phrase about it. If you know how to use a chainsaw,
if you know what you're doing, you didn't just buy it yesterday.
So medically, it was very interesting, and there was a huge surge after an initial pause there was a huge surge in volumes to the EMS system in our hospitals. At one point, it was, boy, and looking over this material, all the names have changed, right? It was Washington Water Power, not Avista. It was Spokane Ambulance, not AMR. And of course, the mayor was different and so forth. But Spokane Ambulance at one point at the peak had a 300% increase in their volume. So they were running around, and they were able to bring in other crews in a gradual fashion to help with that. But we had a lot of emergency calls, and a good number of those were based on people being isolated and didn't know what to do. It wasn't perhaps so much more acute emergency conditions so much as the uncertainty associated with the drama of the ice storm.
And I was first acquainted with you, Gordon, and with you, Pat, at the Spokane County Disaster Council, and where you guys were really effective at representing what kind of a resource you could provide to the community. And for this 25th anniversary of ice storm, it turned out, because it wasn't just a power outage, there was a communications outage, you turned out to be pretty critical. What did you see as you saw things starting to literally fall apart? What were your first thoughts that evening?
Well, I started out the day at 6:30 doing a video shoot for the company I work for. And there was just a little bit of snow on the ground, and it was melting by the time I was out around 8:30 and going back to where I worked. And I thought that everything was going to be fine. Later in the morning, started hearing a lot of sirens around, and we thought, oh, well, there must be an accident down at the corner. And then we kept hearing them, and we kept hearing them, and we kept hearing them. So what's the natural thing to do? You start monitoring public service agencies to find out what's going on. And it was at that time that we realized that there was something a little bit more than just something down at the corner. And I'm not sure that we really realized the full extent of it at that time, but our kind of fire horse mentalities that we had all kind of taken on made us search out what was going on. And we found out that the people that we serve were starting to encounter some problems. And we realized that the problems that they were encountering were things that we had helped them with before. And so in a proactive way, as they had become accustomed to us pursuing, in other words, we were contacting them. Do you need us? We weren't waiting around for them to call us, because we're a volunteer organization, and we're probably kind of one of those organizations that they would forget right at the beginning. But later they would remember, or later they would think, gee, we wish we had called you a little earlier. So this way we made it so that they actually did end up requesting us earlier, and we were right at the beginning of the whole thing. And that was through Fire District 9, who we had this special relationship with, of this proactive kind of operation.
And a piece of that is that at the time, there were 4 different dispatch centers in Spokane County for fire, plus a police dispatch. Everything was a little bit disconnected to begin with. So you're knowing that and hearing what traffic was going on in each of the dispatch centers, I think gave you a global view of the problem that was developing faster than any of those individual centers would have known.
Well, yeah, there is some truth to that. And you get accustomed to monitoring things and knowing when agencies are starting to have trouble being able to communicate with each other. And that was something that we had been called upon to do. Our service, starting with the firestorm in '91 and then through the '90s, working the Spokane Fire Chiefs Association or Spokane County Fire Chiefs Association, and figuring out ways that we could kind of fill some of the gaps in their communication that they had encountered in '91. And also responding to a kind of a large fire situation that existed in 1994. We were pretty well attuned to knowing when those agencies were going to need us, and they were by that time familiar with us and trusted us and invited us in, and we served them.
So Pat, what did you do on that day? How did your day start out?
Well, it was a lot like Gordon's. I was at work and it was obvious that things were getting weird. It was a lot like Firestorm when the winds came up with ice storm, and the electricity, I'm pretty sure, went off at our office, so we closed. And then I was listening on 147.30, which is our Aries emergency. Listen here if you think something's going on. I got sent out to Valley Ford for District 8, and we established a voice link and a packet link out there. And we were pretty busy. There was a lot of issues that came up, a lot of people without water for their stock out in that more rural area, and that became an important factor. So we worked with them, and we had some people at Avista, so we were able to help the fire department, figure out what was going on maybe a little bit before they would have been able to had they tried the phones, which for the most part didn't work anyway. And then I spent a couple of nights at the commands, or at the emergency center downtown, working through the night, keeping the shelters connected and working as net control.
So how did it hit you at home? Everybody who was a responder also had to deal with this at home.
Yeah, so we were without power for about 6 days. And so, we did some takeout, but mostly it was literally cooking over an open fire in a fireplace. So, I know that a lot of people left their home and ended up staying in hotels and things like that. And so,
yeah, it was a long time. There's a lot of lessons learned since then about how to prioritize and how to keep people informed about when the power's coming back on.
Yeah, so we've made some changes since then, but a lot of it's due to current technology, right? I mean, now we have electronic files. Now we all have cell phones, and we have email that we didn't have back then. So we can communicate in closer to real time to folks who are going through these sorts of things. So, but also people are just more knowledgeable. When this ice storm happened in '96, it was really the first time in a very long time that anybody had ever dealt with a wide scale outage like that. So I think that they figured out pretty quickly that power wasn't going to come on for a while, so they ended up having to discard a lot of food. That was kind of the unfortunate thing. But
yeah, and Dave Burns, who was with DEM at the time, he had mentioned one of the things I think you had when we talked before about developing a triage criteria for people who were at shelters, but they really they needed to find someplace with a higher level of care. So you had to figure out how to sort those folks out.
Is this a leading question where you want me to describe the development of this document?
Yes, it's a leading question.
Yes, indeed. Before me, I have the Sheltered Citizen Hospital Index for Triage and Transport. Now, if you make an acronym of those words, it ain't proper, or it's kind of cute. But we had, I think at our peak, approximately 721 citizens in 8 shelters in Spokane. And many of them were those who had comorbid medical conditions, oxygen dependency for us.
Jim, you froze for a moment right when you said people who were oxygen dependent.
Okay. Well, we had a fair number of people on supplemental oxygen at home who were dependent on a power source for that oxygen or delivery of oxygen. So providing that in the shelters was very important. And then we developed a scoring matrix to say, hey, you came to us without power for several days. You have these following medical conditions. You need this level of care. We're going to take you to the hospital. And the hospitals made space both for the sheltered citizens to accommodate them to the extent they could. But it was a nice system. And that scoring matrix still is in the book. We pulled it out and modified it most recently in the pandemic to look at patients, and we had to make it quite different, but the principle was the same. Who could be treated outside the hospital? Because, particularly early in the pandemic, bringing everyone in who was COVID positive was a great way to spread the germ. So we used a similar tool, and that's in the book now as well.
I think every disaster, we learn something that then changes with the next one. There's always something a little different.
Yes, and sometimes we forget what we learned, but
Yeah. I'm talking to Steve Main with Spokane Regional Health District, and Steve, I had asked a couple of people looking for somebody who was there 25 years ago who had to deal with some of the problems. And one of those problems is a little bit different than what people would think about, but with the power out, there was a lot of food at risk. And
Yeah.
and you ended up finding that dumped on your plate.
Yeah. So in 96, this was November is what I'm recalling.
November 19th. Yep.
Yeah. So what happened was back in those days, this is 25 years ago. So in those days, the manager was also the technical advisor for the program. And so our manager took vacation, which had previously been scheduled, and another manager took vacation, which had previously been scheduled. And so that left the division director in charge of the entire division. And, when an event like this happens, there's only so much stretching you can do to one person. So he called on me to basically address some of the issues that were identified during the large scale power outage. So.
And those were, how does a health district have an involvement in a power outage?
The issue with power at a food establishment is that without power, you can't operate your refrigeration, you can't operate your cooking equipment, you can't operate your hot holding equipment. And all these things are necessary, of course, to make sure that food is at the proper temperature so that it's safe to consume. Mm-hmm. And so in many instances, while there was an absence of heat and light, there was also an absence of operable cooking equipment, operable refrigeration, operable what we call hot holding equipment that keeps food hot. And so there were a lot of restaurants, a very large number of restaurants that had to close as a result of that. So
yeah, it wasn't just keeping the lights on, it was a food safety issue.
That's exactly what it was. So we each had to go out and basically drive up or drive through areas where food establishments were located to see if they had power. And if they didn't have power, to make sure that they weren't open. So fortunately, we didn't run into any or too many issues as far as that goes. Where the concern was, of course, is that so that was the issue with restaurants. Then there's another separate issue that is still related involving grocery stores. And so during the power outage, everybody needed to be able to get their groceries, and some or several grocery stores didn't have power. And so they were still open, but they had to relocate all of their food into refrigerated trucks and trailers, which they had to do quite a bit of coordination to pull that off. And so that was a bit of a challenge for the grocery stores to get. For a restaurant, where so much of the food is made to order or made for, they know the timing of when their rushes come and everything, so they can kind of prepare in advance. They had to dispose of a lot of food during that outage. Grocery stores, they still have to provide the food to the consumers, the people that live in our community, and so they ended up pulling out all the stops to get refrigerated trucks and trailers that they could use to keep their food cold. and meet the needs of the people that were coming in that needed to shop and buy.
Did they
food.
just send somebody out the back and go out and get 2 gallons of milk and bring them up front, or how'd they do that?
Well, they did have generators, small generators that could run refrigeration inside as well. And so they would, but they had to, yeah, you're kind of on the right track there. You could only store so much inside, using generators. So then you had to go outside and just keep replenishing these refrigeration units and stuff. So they managed along. They seem to manage okay. There's some foods that they just took a big loss on. Ice cream was one of them.
Well, I would assume that the demand for ice cream might be down a bit during an ice storm.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm going to put this in. Our electricity was off here for about 6 days. And I was pretty much gone the whole time working with Aries. And my wife still reminds me of that on a regular basis. My youngest, our oldest son was off to college, but our youngest son was still here. And I think he got really tired of canned chili and crackers, because that's about all we could cook on the wood stove.
I had an employer who was very sympathetic to my ARES operations, Sulani, and I was gone for 6 days or something like that from work, and suddenly realized at the end of it, and this shows you what kind of tunnel vision you kind of get on things like this. I realized that I hadn't checked in with them for all that time. Now the business had been shut down for a while and was without electricity and so on. So there wasn't much for me to do there, but I hadn't checked in with them for a while and suddenly realized, gee, I better go back to work. But what was really nice about that is that, like I said, they're really, really supportive, and not in just this incident, but many, many others.
I think if one is unhoused and has been coping with that, you've got coping strategies that take into account when it gets really cold. But if you're in your own house, there's a tendency probably for some people to think I'm at home, I'm in my house, everything's fine, and not to really think about a need to make a change.
Right. No, I even experienced that with my own family at the time. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was, tied up at work and literally there for about. So my kids and their mom had to figure out a way, and thankfully we had a fireplace insert, but things like cooking on the top of the cast iron fireplace insert, heating up water to at least bathe a little bit, and then having that fire going all the time at least heated the main core of the house, so that they could remain in place. But there came a time where it was time to relocate and go to grandma and grandpa's house because they had power.
Well, the impacts obviously weren't just at the hospital, but you and all the staff who had to go home and deal with what was going on at home. You had told me before about some incidents at your own neighborhood and how that went down.
Yeah, when Denise came by, our neighbor came by, we were feeding people pretty much a couple evenings afterwards. We had gas stoves, so we were doing meals. And she came by about the third day and her hair was wet. And I said, well, how'd you get wet hair? And she goes, we're taking showers, but I don't know how long the hot water will last. And I said, Denise, do you have a hot water heater that's powered by gas? And she went, oh yeah, we do. And her husband, Jerry, used to work for the heating company. And so he had done a retrofit on their water tank. So I said, well, you may not have your stove, because there's no electricity, but if you have hot water, then everybody's gonna be counting on you for showers. And then I went into the hospital, obviously, with my kit, and I found a shower up on the second floor of the children's hospital. And I thought I was pretty safe. And then about 4 days into it, everybody else found that there was this other shower. And so there was a bunch of people lined up in the hall. And so I'm like going, well, I'm probably going to be going to the neighbors, you know. So anyway, that's how,
Yeah, I think,
that's how.
yeah, I think you'd said the hospital dining room and had was feeding extra people.
About
because
about 4 times as many.
Right, because it was open. The hospitals had power, and they could be counted on as a restaurant.
Yeah, and so people were coming there in droves. I mean, it reminded me kind of on the second and third day of our annual meals that we had at Christmas for the staff. There were people lined up in the hall to get in and to be seated, and it was pretty crowded, but it accommodated a lot of people. They opened up one of the meeting rooms, Mother Joseph room, and started putting people in there. So it accommodated pretty much everybody that wanted to come there for a meal. And so that worked out pretty good.
Perhaps the greatest lesson that we learned about from Ice Storm was that the customer for electrical service has no idea how they get it. And so therefore there were completely unmanaged expectations during that several days that we call the adventure, which was Ice Storm 96. For example, you would have your power out for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days, and even right next door to you, the power never went out at your neighbor's house at all, or across the street. And so this gave rise, I mean, after people get tired of things and, you know, it's cold and the routine has changed dramatically, and, you know, the kids are starting to grouse a lot, and it's getting a little bit testy in the household and all. People began to develop what we started to call Ice Storm 96 power envy, where they knew somebody else had juice. And that was great if they needed to go stay overnight at a neighbor's house or a relative's house. That was great. But they began to say, well, you know, that person whose power is on, you know, they're a former city council member. And, you know, they must have some pull with the power company, because if they didn't, they're on my block and we're all out except for them, that sort of thing. This was happening. And when we were talking to people on the air during that period of time, because we were virtually wall to wall call in day and night through that period, and people would start to grouse about this, and they begin to build up you know, some real anger. And it came to me that the problem here is that they don't understand what these crews are up against, how power gets to them. So Paul Redmond and I had a chat. He was, as you know, CEO of Washington Water Power at the time. Right. And I told him, you know, we need to educate your audience as to how electricity gets from its source to their house. And so I really wasn't necessarily pitching it, but I created a video production that went out to all Washington Water Power customers, both business as well as residential customers, which was an explanation as to how power gets from the dam to your house, or from the power plant to your house, and that sort of thing. And we used something that was familiar to people. We used the highway system, the great big transmission lines. Those are freeways, all right? Mm-hmm. Nothing interrupts them. The power is unlimited as it goes across there, so to speak. And then you get into you know, state routes and county highways, which are lesser, but they're going to a particular direction, all right? And then into city roads or town roads and that sort of thing. And then down ultimately to the service that goes from the power provider to your house, which is essentially your driveway, right? Mm-hmm. And when you do that, you realize that, there's a lot of ways to get from one place to another place, and they're not all the same. I mean, you go the fastest route or whatever, and that's generally what happens with respect to routing electrical energy to customers. You've seen these flickers, for example, little rollout of brownouts happen, right? Where you're out for about 5 seconds, you got to go reset all the digital clocks. But apart from that, you've suffered no problem with that kind of a power hit. The computerization of the process means that the system determines what's the quickest way to restore this situation so we could isolate whatever the problem is and continue people receiving power, which was the gist of this whole thing. We went out the fall of the summer and fall of the following year and worked with crews, water power crews. I was up in bucket trucks all over the place that for several months at that time, and put together a piece that they put out to their customers. They mailed them to their customers so that people could understand how this works. Because if they did understand that, then you can manage expectations. Obviously, the more people know about something, the less they fill in the blanks, as it were. And so if that's the case, you're better off in terms of, because they had thousands of hours, literally, of complaint calls suggesting that, former mayor so-and-so's got power, but I don't, or this guy owns a business and he's got power at his place, but I don't, I'm just a peon and these guys are important folks, and you guys got to admit that, you're using preferential treatment, which was never the case.
No, I think your street analogy works really well, because just like any street system, there's some cul-de-sacs and dead ends where it doesn't, you might be able to see across that dead end to the next street, but there's no connection between the two.
And you'll have, sometimes we found that you'll have like 5 or 6 houses right around the cul-de-sac, and 3 of them are fed from directions the others are not.
Right.
So 3 still have power and the other 2 don't. It doesn't make any sense, because the one that doesn't can be right next door to you.
The last big power outage in Spokane, I was tracking for my mom's power being out, and I noticed they had a much better tool now where you can look down to the address level, and they had areas, shaded around, so you knew you were in this recovery area, and that's why where your side of the street's in one recovery area and the other side of the street's in another recovery area. It was really a lot of really good information so that people could manage those expectations.
Yeah, they've since been a lot more sophisticated about the way in which they graphically present what is going on and where an outage is and what it involves and what their anticipated time of replacement is concerned. But the one thing that people didn't realize with respect to ice storm was how immense the battlefield was. I mean, the amount of damage that was done to the infrastructure of Washington Water Power, it's the greatest amount in the history of that company, and it's been around, as you know, since the 19th century. It's now a Vista, obviously, but the point being that they'd never seen devastation like that. And they had never, you get a power outage in a windstorm, you get a few poles knocked down and transformers that blow up, and then, you do your best. But in this particular case, you couldn't route from X to Y because Y was gone, so was X. And so you couldn't do that. So you needed to figure out, well, how are we going to route power in here from some source we've never routed power through in order to get these folks up while we fix the standard configuration so that we can then put it on those lines again and go with it. And this is the other thing is that we had people that panicked, of course, and they lit their barbecues inside their house, and we had some carbon monoxide poisonings, and we had a couple of house fires, some of which were fatal. And of course, we had Jimmy Dean, who was the water power crewman, who came in contact, unfortunately, with a hot line. And one of the things that, when the contact with lines is when you hook a generator up to your system, then going out to your from your home out to the power pole, you actually step the power back up again. It's these transformers step it down into your house from the greater voltage down to an amperage down to that which your appliances and lights and heating systems can operate on. But if you drive that power with it goes the other way, and it activates power at a much greater amperage or voltage than would ordinarily be the case. And so there were a few close calls with respect to some of the crews that never expected to see a line hot because they knew that it had been down, but all of a sudden it was. That's because somebody had wired their generator into their panel, and it caused those kinds of situations. We learned an awful lot from that in terms of how to be safe during these situations. But
There's been a lot more emphasis on, if you've got your own generator, you've got to have that transfer switch that disconnects you from the grid, so that to keep the
That's
grid
right.
safe.
And a lot of people didn't even know that. I mean, in some cases, we found that they weren't even that warning wasn't even in the manuals for these generators. They didn't warn them about that, so they had no idea that would happen. It never occurred to them. They thought that all the
people
power
are
from the
getting,
generator was inside their house. So
yeah, if people are getting ready for the winter and they've got a generator, they need to be really well aware of that, to be able to disconnect, be solo or be part of the, but don't be backfeeding.
Well, for me, it was an interesting day. I had 2 young children, and my oldest son was in kindergarten. So my wife, who is a nurse, was off that day and was joining him at kindergarten for the Thanksgiving event. So I had gone home to be with my younger son while he was napping in the afternoon. And when the morning was a pretty nice morning, but the weather started changing pretty rapidly. And while I was at home with him is when it really started changing. I lived up on the South Hill, still live up on the South Hill, and the rain started falling and then started turning to ice, and things were going downhill very, very rapidly. In fact, I was kind of waiting and watching, wondering when my wife was going to be back, because I knew I needed to get downtown, monitoring the radio. You could hear the number of incidents were just increasing dramatically from all types of things, down power lines, fires, etc. And you could it was so eerie because you could hear the trees just snapping in my front yard throughout the neighborhood. And my wife, I was able to call her and say, hey, I need you to come home. And it took her over an hour to get home because all of the roads leading up to our home had been blocked by trees that had fallen. So she ended up going all the way around the east side of the South Hill to be able to come back into our home.
So, Dave, this was your first big incident as Director of Emergency Management. And I'm going to tell this story because you've told it to me, and then you can comment. But you had put your first budget together, and you wanted a generator for the EOC, for the Emergency Operations Center at the building on Gardner. And it had gotten turned down by county commissioners because, well, that was too expensive. We don't need that. And then said one of those county commissioners walked into the EOC that got set up in the basement of the fire station downtown and said, what are we doing here? And you told him.
I told him, well, I had budgeted for a backup generator because there was not a backup generator there at the facility. And that was the reason we were where we were, because we had to communicate with a lot of different organizations. And
it was a great I told you so moment.
Yes, it was in some respects. And as a matter of fact, the budget was adjusted, and we did end up getting a backup generator. But actually, the facility that we had identified as the EOC at that time was really not a good enough facility for us to operate anyway. And in reality, moving to that fire station was a much better place. And it served its purpose very well for us.
Well, it's a bit ironic. The other major disaster in the history of Spokane, of course, was Mount St. Helens. And I was in Virginia when that happened. I missed that. And when ice storm hit Spokane, the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs were meeting in Yakima. So I was in Yakima, and as was Terry Mangan, the Spokane Police Chief at the time. And we were in an offsite hotel, a overflow hotel, and they hit overnight. We had over a foot of snow there, and we were out digging our car out trying to get to the meeting. And he said, "Did you hear what's going on in Spokane. Thousands of people are without power. And so we trying to figure out how to get home. I-82 was blocked. Trucks were, if you're familiar with I-82, lots of up and down elevation changes. And the route was blocked with semis. So we spent most of that first day trying to figure out how to get home, and wondering, how bad is this going to be? How cold is it going to get? That made it, that we were very fortunate that it didn't get very, very cold, as it would have probably impacted older people and homeless and so forth much more than it did, fortunately.
I think that that's the most important thing of all. It wasn't that we were replacing communications that didn't exist necessarily, but what we were doing during ice storm was we were augmenting communications, and that's what we would do now. Every link has its limits, and so if you have more links, then you have more chances that your messages are going to get through. One of the things that we appreciated after ice storm was what people were saying about us, is that we were able to supply them some insurance, so some communications insurance. So if we were able to, if we were there, then they knew that if they couldn't get through for some reason, then they had us to see if we could take care of the problem. They could leave the problem with us and then go on with the other problems that they had they had to fill. And if we could fill the bill, that was great. And the nice thing is that they, at the end of that, they didn't really want us to leave, or they felt a little bit funny about letting us go. But and I think that that's the greatest compliment of all, is that we served them to the extent that they were worried about letting us go, just because that insurance was so important at the time.
We also had, I remember one story. Woman called up, she had tropical fish, and her house was getting colder and colder and colder, and she was frightened to death that all of her fish were going to die. And a fella called up a short time later, and he explained a process you could use with a length of copper pipe that you can get at any hardware store, and how to put it over a candle to heat it, and how to route it into, so there's an airflow through it and moving into your tank, your fish tank. And she called up a couple of days later, so the fish were just having a great old time. They'll last forever now. I mean, it worked out fine. This is the kind of stuff that people do, innovative things that people do in a time like that, and other folks who are listening, they just want to be reassured it's going to be okay, and they were. That was, I guess, that was the gist of why we did what we did then, and it worked out. People preferred to know that other people were in it with them, and they weren't alone, and that some folks had some answers that could be of benefit to them, and so they wrote down what they were told and tried it out, and it worked out for them too. And that's what neighbors do.
Yep, sharing information. Your first responders in any emergency are always going to be the people right around you.
Sure. Yeah, always.